Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast, the weekly podcast dedicated to conversations on faith and culture. We are your hosts. I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this week. This week, our topic is going to be human trafficking and all the really difficult things connected to that. And in our segment this week, we'll be talking a little bit about how we do self-care, how we deal with weightier issues like this, especially when they impact us personally. I think this topic is, there's a difficult place. Like, where do we start with this? How do you even begin to formulate a conversation about something like this without feeling super helpless and almost without words, which obviously right now I am stumbling over them. Like, where do we begin a conversation like this?
Yeah, it's such a sensitive issue and it impacts so many people that it's tough to talk about. But I think defining human trafficking and explaining a little bit about it might be helpful for people that don't know what human trafficking is or what it's like in our world.
Yeah, so if I may, I would, and this is such a hard thing to talk about, and I think a lot of people just don't talk about it because it's so hard, but I heard a statistic the other day that more people are in slavery today than were during the slave age in like the 1600s. And so as much of a cultural blight that is for us now to think about the fact that, like we've talked about in our past, our country's built on slavery. Today, the problem is worse globally. So if I may share a few statistics to get us started on understanding even what sex trafficking is. This is a website called Equality Now. And they are basing their numbers on UN statistics, I believe. So at least 20.9 million adults and children are bought and sold into worldwide in commercial sex servitude, forced labor, and bonded labor. Something to keep in mind is that trafficking is not always sexual labor. Sometimes it can look like sweatshops where people don't have agency. They're not allowed to leave. They're not at-will employees. They're not allowed to quit, but they're essentially controlled. Their bodies are controlled. It could look like some immigrants working in the United States who don't have any choice and are abused by their employers, and they are not paid properly. That's considered trafficking too in some cases. And then obviously the sexual trafficking. In that figure, in that 20.9 million, so we'll say essentially 21 million people, in that figure, 21 million people, 2 million children are exploited every year in the global commercial sex trade. About 6 in 10 identified trafficking survivors were trafficked for sexual exploitation. So 60% of trafficking is probably sexual exploitation. The rest is forced labor. And women and girls make up 98% of victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation.
You know what the sad thing about that is? I read recently that only 44,000 victims were identified last year. You're looking at like 20.9 million. Yeah, 20.9 million worldwide, and only 44,000 victims were identified and entered into a database and like actually handled and helped last year, which is an insanely low number, especially when you consider like the same people that put out those statistics said that what the trafficking industry, forced labor and sexual exploitation generates about $150 billion a year. I mean, there's a lot of people benefiting from the slave industry. And so there's a lot of protection for them in different countries. And part of the problem is that it's worldwide and it's not just in the United States or in some localized area. I mean, did you know that there's 104 countries on our planet that do not have a law against forcing children into the sex industry? 104.
Yeah, and I wondered about that because I did see that so on the contrary, we have 134 countries who have criminalized it.
Yes.
But I'm wondering, though, about the legislation on that. It's just probably so hard to outlaw because you try to outlaw things that you can enforce, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's so, like what you said, it's so almost impossible to enforce this. But a lot of times actually just knowing the signs and symptoms of trafficking and knowing what it could look like is helpful for the general public to be able to keep an eye out to say, this situation doesn't look right. This person looks like they might need help. we're going to inquire into this, because a lot of trafficking rings will happen under the glittery surface of a really nice, wholesome community. And everybody thinks that the community is really healthy and happy, but there can be huge trafficking rings.
For instance, I've heard in the city that I live in California, that it's the highest city in the United States for human trafficking.
So that could happen right under your nose. You can walk past a place where this is happening, which is wild to think about. It's wild. And it, makes me ask the question, like, what is our responsibility? Because confronting that stuff can be incredibly dangerous.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
you talked about looking at different signs for wondering whether someone is in a situation where it may be human trafficking or not. Obviously, it's a very hard thing to determine. And a lot of people that are in those situations are scared and don't want to talk about it and don't even know maybe that they're in that kind of a situation. But there are things that you can look out for, right? As like a general society, to keep our eyes open.
There are, and we can post some resources on that. Yeah. But I encourage people just to go out and do research on their own. If this is something we should all train ourselves to watch out for. And I'll give you an example. A friend of mine, and I don't recommend doing this. She's a wonderful person and very, very courageous. But she had done a little bit of work with women who were stripping and working in gentlemen's clubs, and just trying to do a ministry where she just wanted to reach out and get to know them and like bring them gifts, and not necessarily like missionize them or tell them about Jesus, but just show them love, because a lot of women in sex industry in general, whether trafficking or the broader sex industry, so sex workers, prostitutes, people who strip or do erotic dancing, the statistics for abuse and trauma are astronomical, something in the 90th percentile. And a lot of times there are no economic options because there's low education level. So I'm not trying to demonize women who work in the sex industry. This is a lot of feminists have taken this on as a feminist issue, because we want to give women the opportunity to choose whatever profession they should choose depending on their conscience. But at the same time, when the statistics around abuse in the industry are so high, you have to start asking questions like, what is happening here? So anyway, she had been doing this work already, and she had kind of an eye out for when things kind of weren't right, So she went to this nail salon in this really charming village where she lived in the Midwest. And this nail salon, like, she noticed never had anybody coming in and out of it. She went inside and she tried to book an appointment, and they wouldn't let her, and they were treating her really strangely. And so she started knocking on doors. She started like making them like answer questions to her, like, what do you guys actually do? And the staff was being really shifty. And so she called the police. She's like, you guys need to look into this. There's something off here in this situation. And I don't know what happened. I don't think she was privy to know what happened with the police action, but at least she tried. At least she went in there and she took a stand, and it could have been nothing, but it's better to be vigilant than not.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's not like you get to be the hero. Like, there aren't pretty wrap up stories to this, it's more just like having a community that watches out for each other.
Yeah. Well, I think the other issue that seems to be connected with all this stuff is, which we could do a whole episode on separate, is poverty, is economic inequality, is that some people, even though they may not be physically forced or whatever into slavery, which a lot are, but they are economically manipulated because of their situation and because of the economic oppression in their area or whatever. And I read this really, really good book, I don't know, last year, I think, called The Locust Effect. And it really, basically, the whole premise of the thing was to really end poverty. We need to first concentrate on violence, because it's violence and physical aggression towards people that is really perpetuating this idea of people staying in certain places. And they talk a little bit about, they talk a lot about trafficking and other forms of violent oppression from people who are in authority, because then there's all the government and law enforcement corruption that allows a lot of this to continue, even though it obviously shouldn't.
Yeah, gone are the days that slavery means you're chained to a wall somewhere, having to do something in someone's like basement or whatever, because there's way more things involved that prevent people from leaving. And I think the definition of human trafficking has changed a lot over the last 10 years. I was reading a few things about how it used to be defined and how it's defined now. One thing that's really interested me, and that Mona brought up before, was identifying sex workers who are under the age of 18 as sex trafficking victims, because if someone doesn't have the agency to make the decision, if they're not old enough to make a consented decision, then they're technically being trafficked, and whether by a pimp or someone else, right?
Yeah. So recently, Sean Diddy Combs urged the AP, the Associated Press, to stop using the term child prostitute. This happened this past week. And that's really interesting to me, that people are growing in social awareness, that like the term, and unless you stop and think about it, you know, it's just kind of, the term might just come out of your mouth without realizing it. But if you think about it, it's exactly what you said, Alan, that children don't choose prostitution unless there are other motivating factors. So this is what gets really difficult about this, because you can talk to someone working in the sex industry or someone who's been trafficked, and they could tell you in all sincerity that they want to be there. And so you don't want to intervene because you're taking away their choice. However, when you consider, like you guys said, economic motivations, when you consider cycles of abuse and fear of the people controlling or brokering, like pimps, when you consider drug dependencies, that's a huge thing that a lot of trafficking agents will use to control victims. They make them dependent on drugs, and they make it so that person can only get their fix through the pimp or whoever is brokering them. Then that person doesn't want to leave, and it becomes a Stockholm syndrome situation, or it becomes just the person gets really good at lying because they're afraid of the consequences, whether bodily, emotional, physical, or economic, of leaving the industry or pissing off a pimp who could come and kill them or maim them. And so it becomes a tremendously difficult. And on the drug one in particular, this is why it doesn't make sense a lot of times in the legislation, because, for example, like if the U.S. has a criminalized, I'm not super familiar with the criminalization laws on the books today for the U.S., but we have the war on drugs, which criminalizes drug use. And so if someone who is trafficked is caught using drugs, even if they've been trafficked, even if they're not really using drugs on their own accord, they are already criminalized when they get caught. And so there's people are less prone to interact with authorities because they're afraid of being automatically wrong. You know,
absolutely.
Not only that, but I don't know. Obviously, I'm not an expert when it comes to law and all that stuff. So I just have, regardless of drug use, they're already criminalized. I mean, when you see pictures of a raid of a prostitution ring or anything like that, you don't see any men or pimps in handcuffs or their mugshots. You just see the women. And when something like that, if you're in a place and you're in slavery and your building gets taken down and you get arrested, you are charged with, I mean, I can't fathom like how we can get to that place where we've criminalized the victim and not really the perpetuator of the crime.
That's our MO, though, as a country.
Yeah, for two reasons. Obviously, criminalizing victimhood has been part of what we do, whether it's someone who's in poverty and can't pay fines, and we put more fines on top of them not able to pay fines and stuff like that. We've criminalized a lot of different things in our society, but also we tend to look at, especially sexual trafficking, there's a long history of locating the sin in the person who caused society to sin. So it's not necessarily the pimps, but, you know, the thing they're selling, which are human beings, which are the evil. You know, the evil's located in the very visible elements in our society. And that goes back to like medieval times as far as sexual perverseness or something goes for society, things that go against the standard. So there's a lot of deep-seated stuff there, I think, that our culture should definitely look at. And
you know, yes, pimps and brokers are preying on people and abusing people in their time of need, and sometimes just straight up kidnapping people. However, what is often barely talked about or rarely talked about is the Johns, because the pimps and brokers are responding to the demand that is present and sometimes creating it. But the people who are actually paying the money and perpetuating this are like mostly straight white men mostly straight white men who have economic luxury capabilities. And even like, this is where things get really sick, is that in cities and times where Olympics happen and NFL games, like the Super Bowl, like really big games happen, that's when like trafficking and prostitution rates go through the roof. Mm-hmm. And when disasters happen, like Katrina, or like not so much Katrina, it's more like in majority world countries like Haiti, when the earthquake in Haiti happened, known traffickers will all get on planes and go to these countries and kidnap children and young women. And so it's so infuriating to think that during times of celebration and during times of extreme hardship, that's when this nasty, horrific industry rears its ugly head the most, when people are the most vulnerable or the most supposed to be the most celebratory. Isn't that just gross?
Yeah, and the Johns are not, the people who are demanding the sex trafficking are not the ones paying the price most often. And that's part of the reason for that is we expect people these days to be, I don't know, just victim to their own urges, right? You expect boys will be boys, men will be this, they'll take advantage of it if they can. It's almost like there's no locus of control or responsibility put on people. And I don't know, there's not a stigmatization of people just getting what they want, you know? There is a stigmatization in our society of enslaving other people. But you're right. On the other side of the equation, those who are benefiting from the slavery of all these people, of the trafficking of human beings, are not shouldering the public stigma that they should be, right?
At all.
Yeah.
Shame. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It can be done in secret, so they don't have to. They don't have to think. They don't have to think. And you know, I think there's this. I don't know, I would like to hear what you guys have to say, being men, because I know this is, I'm not trying to say all men are culpable of this. There are many men trying to fight trafficking and men like you who are talking about this. So I'm not trying to implicate everyone, but I think that there is a prevalent concept of masculinity that is allowing for this really harsh male fantasy that women ultimately do exist for their pleasure. And when a woman looks them in the eye and say, yes, I want to be here, they are socialized to not ask any questions, to not read the look in their eyes, to not wonder about the situation at all. They just take their male right to have this body. And so I think for me, underlying questions of it are like kind of along the lines of what you're saying, but in a deeper sense, like what are we telling men that they are entitled to over the bodies of other people and over seeing other people as people?
I'm sure that's true. I'm sure because of the way things are portrayed in media for men, I'm sure that there's a huge element of that. For someone like me and my personality, it's hard to see that. What's more powerful and insidious for me is the narrative that we're always spinning that men are just constantly looking for opportunity, right? Men are just seething under the surface. And if an opportunity comes up, they're going to take it, regardless of who they are or who the other person is. And like, that's the picture we've painted of masculinity. There is no self-control. There's just society puts limits and then men push those boundaries. And then when there's an opening, like that's when they satisfy their urges. And so for me, it's almost like the Pygmalion effect, you know, the old story of a person making a statue that became into a real woman. And when you tell someone over and over and over that this is what they are, that's what they become. They live up to those expectations. And I think if we as a society tell men like over and over, you just think about sex all the time, you're just looking for opportunities, you know, and then also advertising and basing everything on that for men, it's almost like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's what masculinity becomes. So it's not just power over someone else. It's also eroding someone's sense of self-control and personhood and agency, in my opinion. So it's like a double effect. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah.
Which is unfortunate. So it's telling someone they have no power and they're allowed to have power if they don't have any power over themselves and they have the right to take power over other people. It's a pretty dangerous combination, right?
Yeah. It's easy to make it about sex, but it's clearly about a structure that's a patriarchy, in the sense that, I mean, if we go back to the issue of Johns, I mean, I've read articles where they just let the Johns go in a raid and they just get the prostitutes. So this idea of like two are equally culpable in this assuming it's a non-trafficking situation, equally culpable in this exchange of illegal activity, and only one is punished and the other is just kind of like, oh, don't do it again. Here's your slap on the wrist and all that kind of stuff.
Well, and here's where it gets really dicey. Again, it goes back to our legal system, because a lot of the Johns have economic wealth and they have power in that wealth. The ones who get off often the most are the ones who have friends on city council and who know judges and who can pay a really good lawyer. And so if going back to the DA issue that I talked about earlier, that most DAs have an average of like 7 to 10 minutes to review a case, that the prostitute or the trafficked or the victim or whoever it is, and even the pimp, a lot of times, they have less representation than the Johns do a lot of times, And so it's like this idea of like, oh, well, you did something bad, Mr. John, but we don't want to ruin your reputation. We don't want to ruin your family because, the police force or whatever. So, it's hard for me not to read whiteness into this, because whoever...
Yeah, the race is a huge part of it. You were just telling us about a story, right? Of an article that came out about how even in selecting trafficking victims, race plays a role.
There are a lot of articles out there about, and Vogue's done some really, really good exposés on this. I encourage you to read it. We'll put some links. But yeah, how teenage American girls who have like fair skin and blonde hair are regularly kidnapped or sold by their own family members to trafficking rings. This gets crazy. This is like, it sounds like something out of a fiction novel, but it happens on a daily basis. These young girls get sold, and because they're perceived as fair-skinned, they are fair-skinned and blonde, they're perceived as higher value in the trafficking rings, and so they're treated differently than someone with dark skin, and that's considered a lower value. So there's even this horrific racial hierarchy within a lot of trafficking systems. So women of color absolutely get the brunt of this. They'll probably be treated worse on average than white women, even though it's all, I feel like really upset and sick even talking about this, but I want to talk a little bit about that question of prostitution versus trafficking. How should we think about this? Because if most prostitutes are victims of abuse at some point, a lot of them childhood abuse, and a lot of them have drug dependencies. A lot of them are just navigating PTSD. For real,
psychological trauma. Yeah.
Psychological trauma, having, no economic opportunity. Like, there are some people who've come out in the last 10 or 20 years and said, I'm a prostitute and I like it. And I choose my clients, like the Pretty Woman narrative. Mm-hmm. But the harsh reality is that the percentage of prostitutes who have complete control over their bodies and their time and are not in danger is incredibly low. So I don't want to take agency away from those women and say, no, you're not empowered, even though you say you are. However, like 99% of prostitution has all of these intersecting things, So it's hard for me to make a separation there at all.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's fair,
So you're saying looking at prostitutes not as people who are just morally bankrupt, but there's other stuff going on. And so maybe crafting a society that has more empathy toward them, or at least more understanding that there's mitigating factors for people who are in those professions. Right?
Well, and they might be saying that they're there voluntarily, but they might actually be trafficked, or they might actually be coerced or compulsed to be there. So it's hard to say that you shouldn't take people's word, but in this particular case, you really can't in a lot of ways.
And that's the same thing for other situations. I mean, there's other situations, like in the case of child abuse, you don't just take the narrative that's given to you right away and then walk away. You know what I mean? You do more investigation than that.
Well, clearly you do, but do they in reality? I think that's I think one of the main chunks of this conversation is the way that our law is completely incapable of handling mental illness. It is all about the action itself and not the reasons or the circumstances that surround it. And there's a little bit to that, but like Mona said before, to really bring those things out, you need a good lawyer. You need someone that is going to fight and do that work and typically it seems that they do that work on the other side of the fence that allows people to get away with this stuff instead of really, really helping people. So I think in terms of prostitution, I think First of all, I'm not a proponent of harsher punishments make people not do something. However, in this case, I believe that if we reversed the punishment when it comes to prostitution, as far as a lighter punishment on the actual prostitute and a heavier punishment on the John, I believe that that's not going to prevent someone necessarily in the short term from not going to a prostitute, which there's a good chance that that is not a healthy situation on the prostitute's end, like Mona just said. However, I believe over time, what's even more powerful, it creates a new cultural narrative that says the woman has the advantage in this situation. And I think that is worth more in the long run. Because I think on the other side of that, like I think there's a heavy responsibility that people in Hollywood and all that kind of stuff are not taking when it comes to this, because in a lot of ways, they're setting the way that people see the world, and they're setting norms that people don't realize are there. And they're perpetuating a lot of the ways that men view their interaction with women that we've talked about before and all that kind of stuff. And I think that sometimes those things help because they create a new cultural narrative where people can, I don't know, shift their focus to a new demon, which maybe needed to be happening.
Yeah, it's more complicated than that, though. Like, I think it's a little bit important to resist the general essentialism, because a lot of brokers, for example, are female. So what do you do in that case if the woman always has the upper hand? But you're making a good point, though, and I want to say there have been a couple countries that have changed their whole outlook on this, like Sweden, and have criminalized Johns and decriminalized sex workers, and have stated publicly that they've had astronomically different results, and also have decriminalized drug use and treated drug users as people who need help instead of punishment. But I always wonder about that, though, because like that reporting it's easy to gloss over that reporting and just say, hey, look, we fixed this. Like they've reduced trafficking by like 70% or something like that. But maybe the face of it just changes. Like I don't want to ever think that it completely goes away. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. But I think that those help because I think the tendency with law in general is the harsher the punishment, the more you're dehumanizing criminals and you're making it look like. And we see this a lot. We've talked about this a little bit when we talked about the prison system and all that kind of stuff. But I think that there's probably a new face, because I think a lot of these criminal organizations or horrible people are going to adapt. But at the same time, I think, like I said before, cultural narrative is important to really change things in the long run.
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting. Like the more we demonize something, the less we are likely to assume people are capable of it. You know what I mean? So, for instance, like if trafficking human beings is the worst thing that could ever possibly be done, which I do believe it is, and we don't talk about it and we make it more taboo, people get away with it more. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
that's a really interesting thing. But looking at humanity and recognizing that there's the capability of stuff like that in other people, and that they're not crazy demon monsters that are a totally alien race. They're actually part of us and they're who we are. And human beings are capable of that. Opens up society to actually look at the problem instead of just shoving it under a rug somewhere and saying these are just a different, form of humans or something.
Yeah, because this particular evil persists in the blindness of the majority. Like it happens underneath our nose, And I would even say, let's extend compassion to Johns and people who maybe have sex addictions and are hiring prostitutes, because they need help too. They have probably repressed some crazy shit, and they need to be in therapy, and they need counseling. They need, to be in support groups, and they need to look at their actions and how they're affecting people and how they're affecting their families. So
you can look at it through incentives too. You need to incentivize their ability to come forward and stop doing what they're doing, right?
Yeah, so I guess if we totally criminalize it, it might go further underground, and
that's what I mean.
But it's hard, because I think if you take these arguments to their extent, what you end up doing is just decriminalizing the whole industry, and then there's no regulation, and why would someone choose to be regulated when they didn't have to be? And so you still have a black market. And so this is a really dicey ethical, legal situation.
We need to be able to stand and be like, human beings are capable of some massive evil, but human beings are still human beings. So on the one hand, we need to be very vigilant and look out as a society for those things. And on the other, not blush when we see it. You know what I mean? And that's like a really hard thing to do at the same time, to be able to stare a problem in the face and call it out where it's at without destroying other people in the process. Yeah.
Yeah, something you said earlier, Jeff, I want to like push back against it a little bit. That I agree that violence is a huge problem. And yes, we'd all love to see violence stopped. But I think when it comes to economics, I think that economic insecurity, so insecurity about housing and food and stability, that perpetuates so much violence. And so if we can actually address that first, like let's say, for example, that every woman, because we're talking about 98% of women, every woman and anybody living on our shores, even if they're an immigrant, we make one less fighter jet that year, and we give that money to people to have adequate housing and and food. No, I know it's funny, but it's like so horrifying.
It's true though
that we have that money. We have the money to do that. That's
not even an overstatement though. The whole one less fighter jet thing.
So but the other side of that is if you look at, and the book that I read, The Locust Effect, really brought this out that I didn't think about that or this aspect of it. But he uses the example of a young girl in Africa who someone comes in and provides for them economically. They provide for their family. They give the girl the books and everything she needs to go to school, because obviously education is a huge part of this as well, but gives her everything that she needs that poverty wasn't providing for her to go to school. But she didn't go to school because if she walked by herself to school, she would be a victim of violence. And that even given in certain situations, especially in smaller places around Africa and South America, even given them the economic freedom that they need, they're still scared to move forward because of the violence that is perpetuated in their culture, and that both of those need to be handled and dealt with at the same time because one can prevent the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the infrastructure has to be there to protect people who want to live peaceful lives. Yeah, that's a really great point. So how do you stop violence? Like, how do you stop this?
Well, I think a lot of that violence.
Everybody. Sorry.
You tag everyone with geomarkers. You tag everybody with chips and like track them. You know, like maybe we need less privacy. I mean, maybe privacy is the price we pay for actually stopping this stuff. And we tag
Mona
everybody
arguing for the mark of the beast.
I am. I don't know
I'm down.
I was given the option to have a geotag in my body, and that, you know, if I go missing, you could find me. Like we do this with dogs, you know.
Yeah.
I don't see the problem with that. That's not infringing on my privacy. That's trying to keep me safe. So I don't know.
Well, I think a big part of it, and we've talked about it already, is patriarchy. Like I think we maybe progressed to a certain level in our country, but I think especially when we're talking in terms of trafficking, where the majority of the violence is men against women, men who are in a higher position, and men who, because of whatever their culture tells them about what it is to be a man, feel validated to perpetuate this kind of violence because they view themselves as superior in something. And I think that's true for most men in the world. On some level, there's that thought that sometimes needs to be, you know, fought off purposely by us individually, but the system perpetuates that. And I don't think that we can really separate that from this particular issue, especially because of the prominent issue of sex trafficking and young girls and women who are caught in these things. There has to be an ongoing, sustained, changed narrative so that the next, because to a certain extent, I think that a certain generation is lost when it comes to this, but it needs to be something that's sustained so that the next generation, their norm is we're all equal. And we've seen it happen on certain levels with racism and when it comes to the LGBTQ community and stuff like that. Like the normative cultural narrative is slowly changing the mind, and each generation after is getting a little bit more accepting of that. And I don't think we've done enough when it comes to men and women in that area. I think we made a little bit of progress and then figured, we're good now and we'll just stop.
Yeah,
I think you could cast that discussion in terms of belonging versus ownership. Like, I'm just thinking about conversations all three of us have had before about women being, especially girls, but all kids in general, being owned by their father or being owned by their family, and seeing that as the dominant narrative. And when they go to get married, there's this transferal of ownership from one man to another or whatever. But like thinking in terms of kids belonging to a family as opposed to being owned by parents or owned by a family might be a helpful step in the right direction. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I read an article about, or a blog post about parents who
started to talk to their young daughter about her body, about like, this is your body, you know, is this mommy's body? No, this is not mommy's body. Is this daddy's body? No, this is not daddy's body. This is my body. And asking the kid permission to be picked up. I've actually started doing that with all my nieces and nephews, with kids I interact with. Before picking them up and hugging them or doing anything like that, I just make this simple, it takes 20 seconds. You just say, hey, can I pick you up and hug you? And when they say yes, then I go ahead and do that. Even that very simple request starts to teach them that this is their body, because when they get older, the concept of being owned by other people doesn't really go away. I mean, it never really does.
And that's a big thing for us when our girls were born, that was almost top on the list, is that when they get to that place where they're ready to hug and all that kind of stuff, is asking them. Even us as their parents, we ask before, you know, the only time we pick them out with our permission is if they're throwing a tantrum or something. But other than that, like, those things are super, super important. And I don't remember. I'm going to try to find this for the show notes, but someone ran across an article that they shared on Facebook a while back that I read that was really just simple things when it comes to, because I mean, the statistics about how many women are going to be abused in our country, America, forget all that's going on in the rest of the world, that we seem to have these colored glasses as far as it's so much worse outside of our country. But even in our country, I think it's something like 1 in 6 women will be sexually assaulted by the time they finish college. Like, it is absolutely ridiculous. But this article is just practical things that you do with a child, like asking permission, like you said, Alan, of hugging and all that kind of stuff. And that becomes sometimes difficult when family members, because, you know, you have that, I don't know, weird uncle or whatever that's like, hey, you know, come over here or whatever. But really setting those simple boundaries of someone being able to be aware and have their own, man, I don't know what the word is, their own agency. Their own agency, exactly.
Can I extrapolate that for 1 second, just real quick? It goes beyond kids. I think that one of the narratives we pick up from the Bible, like hearing some of the stuff in the New Testament about a wife owning the husband's body and a husband owning the wife's body, there's a lot of talk about owning someone else sexually. And maybe there's a biological reason for that as well. But like, the concept of owning somebody else needs to be unraveled and unseated from this sense of, you don't own any. You may be married to somebody, you do not own your wife. You may be married to a man, you don't own your husband. That alone teaches people in college. Jeff, you're referring to people being sexually assaulted. That's because there's ownership as far as girlfriends and boyfriends go. Like, oh, your boyfriend cheated on you. You don't have a right to beat him up for that. Oh, your girlfriend cheated on you. You don't have a right. You can't treat them as if you owned them, as if they were your property. Right?
Yeah, I agree you're getting at something, but I don't think it's that simple, because most of the people who are abusing others have themselves been abused, and until they look at that and heal from that, they're never going to be able to stop that cycle of violence, because that's all they know. I'm not saying that they're not responsible for their actions, but I am saying that there are extenuating circumstances that contribute to that. What I think for me is the most salient, I agree, like teaching people that their body is their own. You know, there's a big parenting move right now to say no forced affection. We're not going to be like, give someone so-and-so a kiss or a hug. Like, you're not going to command children, especially to display forced affection. Like, they're taught that they never have to be compelled to show affection or to touch anyone. However, trafficking falls apart in those things, though, because these are people who are there against their volition. So it's not like they're allowing someone to own their body. They're being forced into that situation.
True, but I mean, if you look at, and this is, I don't want to minimize it at all, but if you look at in terms of home robberies, a lot of people that are getting robbed, they leave their door unlocked. And if a robber, like, sometimes a robber will go to a house and if it's locked, they'll just move on to the next house. So I'm not saying that it's a perfect analogy, but in the case of trafficking, there might be less instances if there is a fight. You know what I mean? Because it's not just
there are people who are being trafficked who don't have a sense of their own personhood,
and it makes it easy. They're going to go for an easy target, and the family too. Like, you need to change
on that. I mean, if someone sells you or kidnaps you or beats you, I mean, I think it's easy to say, well, you should fight back, but that's not safe.
I'm thinking of what I'm thinking of are the people who are a part of the sex industry in the United States. I watched a documentary on several girls who had been caught up in it. They're like 16, 15, 17, and they come from home situations where they're just moving from something that wasn't good at their home to something that's slightly better with their John or whatever, or their boyfriend who started selling them out. And so, like, as a society, I'm talking like public education, starting with kids really young and teaching them that their body is their own might be a way to at least prevent some sort of thing from happening. If there's like a safety and there's that kind of envelope in the public space, people might not have to look for that in other places.
And part of it's family education too, because a lot of these girls are sold by their families when they don't even know better. And if you educate families when it comes to stuff like that, I think that helps. And again, I think anything we're talking about, there's not one magic solution. I think all of these elements have to be in place at different levels, and that none of them are going to solve by themselves. But I think it's together, all these things will help take a big chunk out of this particular issue.
I don't know if like telling families, hey, don't sell your kids is going to work. Like you can go to great lengths to do PSAs or to have, but if someone is intent on selling a kid that they birthed or that their brother or sister birthed, like,
but that comes out of a cultural place of how a culture will view women, which is why, again, I advocate for some way to change the long-term narrative.
I don't think so. I think it's a lot of times it's economically motivated, or there's horrific cycles of abuse in that family. I don't think that anyone would do it just because it's a cultural practice. Maybe that's happened sometimes, but so maybe it has to be both and. But what I would like to talk about for a moment is that again, if you trace the supply and demand of this, there will always be people who do horrible things like sell their children, even if they don't want to do it, but they're compelled to do it. Okay. But there are, on the other side, the people who buy these services are the ones we need to be looking at, not the people who sell, because if they won't sell the child, if there's no market for the child, do you know what I mean? Like we have to radically reconfigure our concepts of masculinity. And I think we were onto something earlier. What comes to mind for me is this concept of masculinity that is really similar to those people who pay a lot of money to like kill giraffes and rhinos and stuff. Like the Cecil the Lion guy. Like, what is it? Yeah, what is it that we're teaching, especially boys, that to be a man, you have to be a predator? And I wonder if instead of just saying, hey, don't be a predator, we can give an alternate concept of what it means to be heroic. And it means to put that energy somewhere that's positive, that it is a positive place to our society. Okay, so I'm not saying...
That's really interesting.
I'm not saying that guy was responsible for trafficking or prostitution. I'm not saying that. So I just want to clarify that. But I see a really strong link between the erotics of violence and between eroticism and violence, like the erotics of violence.
I even see that in economic terms, though, too. The idea of the predatory male is huge. I just saw something on Facebook. There was a trending topic on a school no longer lets tag happen. Like playing tag was hurting kids. So they just said no more tag during recess. So this like libertarian, self-proclaimed capitalist evangelist posted this thing. And there was only like 100 people that liked his post. But for some reason I found it. And he was like, see, this is why I homeschool. My kids are going to eat those kids for breakfast and blah, 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 blah. I kept talking and I was like, is this guy like a parody? But I looked him up and apparently he's not. Still, like the concept of I'm going to create the perfect predator in my child is something that feeds into this kind of thing. Like our system, even our businesses, like our neighborhoods are set up on the predatory system. So how can that not be how we look at everybody? You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. And you can argue that racism is predation too. It's the people, whatever group happens to be at the top, which is normally white people, get to prey on the bodies and time and lives of others who are not in that group. And so, yeah, I think to radically reconfigure our ideas of predation and power and like what we get to live, and I think, parents are probably trying to prepare their kids for the real world. And they think to be in the real world and to survive is to be on top. And so challenging the whole hierarchy of it is going to be really helpful to get at the base of this and why people hire sex workers in general. Like, forget about the sex workers, talk about the people who hire, talk about the people who rent the organ space, as one 13-year-old victim put it. We have a culture that's fostering that behavior and that allows people to get away with it and it's totally scot-free.
There's a lot of layers to this. And we could probably keep going forever and ever and ever. Because again, there's so many connections to this and so many like feelings connected to it too. Like forget statistics and all that, but just the feeling you get when you think about someone being forced into this life or any kind of slavery, whether it's sexual or economic or whatever. So let's close out by just giving our kind of final thoughts and takeaway before we move on to our segment.
I only have one, and it's just completely practical. If you or anybody you know may be involved in sex trafficking, or if you yourself were involved with sex trafficking in some way, a victim, there's a number you can call. It's 1-888-373-7888. And that's the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. So if you have suspicions, go ahead and call that number. If you're caught up in it, you can call that number as well, and they will help you out and give you the resources you need.
So that's not just for sex trafficking, then that's for all trafficking. We didn't talk much about labor, but that's
all human trafficking. If you're not allowed to leave your workspace, call that number.
Yeah, that's good. My final word on this is to look at I'll use a big word for a second, and I'll explain what it is, the intersectionality. What that means is that the overlapping systems of oppression. We've talked about many things today, race, economics, so on and so forth, that there is not just one way to look at this, and you have to look at it in an intersectional way. You have to think about all these factors at once, or you get into some territory that doesn't represent what it might mean to unravel and undo this institution.
And for me, I would say on a personal level, start with where you're at. Like, never be afraid to reevaluate the way in which you're viewing a particular issue and how it may be colored by just your bubble, and always find ways to kind of poke out of that, because I think these issues are easy to dismiss when you're only hearing them from one source, or you're not really taking into account where you obviously may not be culpable when it comes to your actions, but you may be perpetuating a philosophy or a system that is really allowing these things to continue. So let us know what you think. If you have anything to add to this conversation, you can comment on the show notes at irenicast.com/36. And there you'll find links to all the stuff that we talked about, including the number that Alan gave just before. On the other side of the music, we'll be sharing a little bit about how we do self-care. Well, after a heavy topic like that, I think for this week's Noah Jamonin segment, and for those of you that don't know, Jamonin is kind of our celebrity triplet name, where we've kind of squished all of our names together, and it's a time where we kind of just share a little about what we're interested in. In the past, we've done things more entertainment-based, but because of the weight of this conversation, we thought it would be a good idea to just kind of share what we do for self-care, how we deal with the difficulties of life, whether it's something far off that we really want to help and be a part of changing, or whether it's just difficulty that we have in our regular everyday life, like relationships and all that kind of stuff. How do we maintain a healthy state of mind or a healthy spirit in interacting with some of the difficulties of our world? So this is Noah Jamonin Self-Care Edition.
I'm so glad we're doing this, because I just felt sick through that whole conversation. So it is hard when we confront these issues, or when we're confronting privilege, or when we're feeling helpless, and sometimes all three of those things at the same time, that there is an emotional component. And if it doesn't pull on your emotions or affect you, then you might not be looking deeply at it, And so it's this kind of, it almost feels masochistic at a point, because it's like you're kind of conditioning your ethical or your moral sensibilities to be resensitized to the hurts of the world. But in so doing, it's really hard to take care of yourself. And so I'm really glad we're doing this. Something that for me is very helpful is reconnecting to my body and my senses, and doing things that nurture and cultivate my senses. So for example, lovely food or dancing, things that make me feel more in my body, because it's really easy to just get really locked into thinking about the world and forgetting to enjoy the beautiful parts of the world that do exist. And it's hard, because when you start empathizing with people who are going through hard things, you're like, well, I have access to this night of dancing or this food that other people don't. And so it feels like there's a guilt implicit in enjoying those things, but we still have to stay engaged with the beauty of the world, or we lose hope. So for me, it's important to do things that make me feel like I'm connected to my body. So yoga, dancing, food, things that awaken and enrich the senses, kind of a thing.
For me, I'm an external processor, so I just like talking with other people. And I have some strategic conversation partners that I talk to every single week. That way I don't offload all of my problems on one person. Vicky, my wife, is a really amazing resource. We talk about almost everything. And so just talking about stuff for me helps me work through some of the stuff that I'm dealing with. Obviously, I talk with you both off air, and that's a really huge thing for me. And especially because I do some volunteer work at the hospital and stuff, and I see some pretty hard things. It's always different when I get to talk about something. Of course, I'm always HIPAA compliant or whatever, but it's always easier for me to deal with a problem that I'm facing if I'm able to just remove it from myself and talk about it as if it's not who I am and a part of me. So that's probably the biggest thing. But I would also say for me in self-care, that sounds kind of funny, but I started using the elliptical because my knees were pretty bad in high school. And so getting on the elliptical machine, it's so automatic that you don't even have to think about working out. You just set the program up and then you go into it. And I found that after about 30 minutes, instead of just being brooding and thinking about all the horrible things in the world, it like flushes my brain so I can think clearly. But until like that 30-minute mark, life's pretty rough and heavy. I always feel so light and free afterward.
I am the worst when it comes to self-care, but there are some things that help because I tend to bottle up and just, basically I'll deal with it on myself. I can handle it. Creative things are important for me. So I think maybe that's part of the reason why I've been attracted to the ministry and especially teaching and preaching, because I feel it's a creative outlet for me as well, where I can express things and take things and mold them and shape them in a way that hopefully brings beauty or inspiration to people or even just myself, because there's a certain amount of pride that you feel when you feel that you've created something worthwhile. And that's part of the motivation for the podcast and all that kind of stuff, is that those things are helpful for me. Also, going on a hike, which I do not as much as I'd like to. I live in a beautiful area with just like mountains and the ocean right next to each other, and there's all kinds of great things to do. And just having those moments where I can just, I know a lot of people like silence, but I like either music or even just listening to other podcasts while I'm just walking and being able to enjoy and all that kind of stuff. Those things are huge for me.
They say nature is really good for your psychological well-being. Like if you just look at a tree in the middle of a really crowded city, people's stress levels go down like crazy. That's why I have a picture of a leaf on my phone.
I was just at a lecture. It was really interesting of a really famous social ethicist who was doing work on city planning. Like, what are the cities of the future going to look like? And how do we create cities and design cities that can help people connect spiritually and connect to each other? It was really cool. But he was talking about some studies that have shown that the more people are connected to nature, the more they're connected relationally to other people. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, because they're not tapped out mentally all the time. They're not, constantly stressed and overworked in their brain, just as far as sensory perception goes. So they have more time to connect to each other. That's kind of cool.
I mean, we are creatures, right? First and foremost. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, but if you're an introvert, sometimes connecting with people is that stress. It is that, I don't know.
Overstimulating?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the whole city is overstimulating. And so if you're an introvert, you're even less, you know what I mean? That's actually what the study is that when you look at buildings and cars and noises and this and that, the brain is so tapped out. But when you look at a tree, it like recovers a lot of the...
Yeah. Well, I think it depends. Like, honestly, I could be just as content sitting in the middle of a busy city and feel just as relaxed. Like, there's something about the busyness and all the things
so weird.
that I know. I recognize that.
I don't feel, if I just have like a little bench to sit on.
I think it's what you're used to. I think if you're transplanted in this city, and it can be reflective of all that energy and stuff like that. But sometimes it's comforting for me to sit into middle of a place where all these other people are busy, because I can be like, oh, I'm not the only one. And sometimes I feel like I'll sit in a middle of a busy place or whatever, and that image where there's one person sitting down and everything's moving in like all fast around them and stuff like that.
Like all the 90s
movies. There's a lot of that, like
videos.
I literally feel that sometimes, and I like it. It's very peaceful. Like I like to know that things are happening and things are being created and all that kind of stuff. And it can be equally peaceful. It is equally peaceful for me than necessarily going on a hike. But I think the hike thing is less about nature and more about exercise for me, probably, because I can't sit on an elliptical. I get bored. I think I have adult ADD. So if I'm on elliptical and
I
I'm
get
just
so bored in the gym. Oh,
I hate it. So
much.
if I exercise, it has to be
I love it.
It has to be active for me. So I think the hiking thing is definitely less about nature, although that's part of it, and more about just moving and not being bored.
That's why I dance. I mean, it's like I am doing something interesting enough that I forget that I'm exercising.
That's not the point is, see, for me, it's the total opposite. I love just like getting lost in it and being like, nothing else matters right now except what I'm doing. Working.
How do you keep your mind on it though?
I don't know. I listen to music and stuff. And
okay.
Seriously, after 30 minutes, it's like the whole world disappears. It feels so good.
Wow.
So I have we all have problems. we all have problems. I think that's what we're arriving at.
I think so. We all need somewhat. I think that's the point. I think that anytime, and I think this is true with anything, we come up with a formula, and then people write a book about it, and then they feel like if I don't follow that formula, then maybe there's something wrong with me. Instead of just being like, this is who I am, and this is what works for me, and you can try it, and if it doesn't work, don't feel bad about yourself. There's just something better that works for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Here's my new thing. This is what I've been like thinking about this past week, and I'm going to try to implement it. The 30-30-30-30. Maybe this can become like the next internet fad of like self-care.
That's a lot of 30s.
I know, but this is what I want to do. It's a 30-day challenge to have 30 minutes each of exercise, deep relaxation, and bliss. So like play. Like every day trying to do those three things. So that's just, you're committing to an hour and a half a day to do those things, and maybe that would feel awesome.
Who has time to be human anymore? Come on.
I know, right? Though that is difficult.
I'll replace the 30 minutes of relaxation with 30 more minutes of play, and then I'm down. Because relaxation is boring. Like that when we had the meditation episode, or the mindfulness episode, I really tried to like really incorporate that into my life, and I'm still trying because I think there's some benefit to it. Obviously, we laid out a lot of reasons why there is, but man, just like I can't do it. I can't I think I got to 10 minutes once where I was just like, okay. But it took me a long time to get to 10 minutes of just
I know it's
nothing.
Hard. Well, I'm not saying like empty your mind. I'm saying like deep relaxation. So taking a bath, laying in a sunbeam, like sitting and chilling on your porch with music, but just like sitting still and just breathing. Like you can think about whatever you want, but just deeply relaxing and letting all your systems just go, you know?
And having nothing, on deck that you have to do.
Because mind emptying relaxation doesn't work for me, but I've realized that deep relaxation time is really, really healthy for me. So, yeah.
Cool. 30-30-30-30.
30-30-30 for 30.
And then I'll feel guilty when I don't do it.
So maybe don't do the last 30. Don't do the 30-day challenge, but just...
And then when you do it, you'll feel guilty because you could have been doing something else.
That's right.
Mitigating guilt maybe is the theme of this one, but I like this. This is nice. We all have very different approaches. It's interesting.
I think so. Well, I think that'll do it for us this week. Thank you so much for joining us. If you like what you hear, we'd really appreciate your support of the show by going to iTunes and Stitcher to rate, review, and subscribe. And probably the best way you can support the show is tell a friend that you think might be interested in the topics that we bring up. And you can contact us anytime with questions, opinions, feedback at our feedback page at irenacast.com/feedback. Yeah, so I think for this week, that'll do it. I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
Thanks for joining the conversation.